Sarah Bloom-Raskin, I wanted to come to you in terms of whether or not you felt he was more or less downbeat in terms of his outlook for the economy going forward than we've heard over the last couple of months.
Right. So he had a difficult message here because while he was communicating to markets that the Fed has stepped in big, and is going to stay in big, at the same time, he has to acknowledge that the unemployment situation is really quite dire. We've got 30 million people out of jobs. And at the same time, he noted that the number of job openings is not commensurate with the number of people looking. So he's starting to introduce this idea that there's a gap between the number of people who want jobs and the number of jobs there are. And that gap is going to be a highly depressing factor in terms of the economic outlook. And he has acknowledged it's going to take a long time to remedy. It's the biggest that we've seen in our lifetimes. And it's going to have profound consequences for the contours of what a recovery looks like.
So, Paul, the obvious question out of that is what more can the Fed do? And thanks to our Jasmine Wu on our team, because I asked her to count the number of times he said tool or toolkit, because that's the key question, right? What's left in there for them to do if the economy does not come back quickly and they are so downbeat? What's the answer, Paul?
I think he did what he needed to do, which is to say it's Congress's job to stand up and do with vigor like the Fed's been doing. So I think this was as big a handoff to Congress as he possibly could do in the context of the Fed's independence. I think the Fed can do more things technically, but I think he really pounded the table that it's Congress's job to actually make grants, that the Fed's in the lending business, and loans aren't necessarily the right remedy for a great deal of our problems. We need to have helicopter money from Congress, period. And that's essentially his...
By the way, Wilfred,
Paul, why is that money sitting over at the Fed? So, Paul, why is that money sitting there? It's not being used. Should the Fed give it up, give it to Congress? Let's get some grants going. Businesses are in need. Businesses are closing right now. You look at the percentage usage of the Fed's balance sheet. Balance sheet's actually been declining since early June. I'm surprised this is not a bigger issue that the Fed, the ruling government, Paul, is use it or lose it. Fed has not been using it.
Well, it has been using because there hasn't been customer demand for it, and they wouldn't naturally give it back. It's up for Congress to either take it back or simply allocate more money. And I think that's the right answer, is independent of the unspent capital that Treasury has for the joint ventures under 13.3, Congress simply needs to spend more money. If they want to take it back,
Dana,
that's
just
fine,
want to come,
but that's not a big issue.
Dana, I want to bring you in to the conversation as well. What did you make of his outlook when it came to the jobs market? A sense, perhaps, that he didn't expect that very fast jump in employment that we saw over the last couple of months to continue. And what does that mean for your outlook for the rest of the year for GDP in the U.S.?
Sure, absolutely. We're looking for minus 3.3% on GDP for this year, and then a bounce back of 4.4% next year. In terms of what Chair Powell said, very much so, the pace of recovery is going to be dependent upon the virus itself. These are real people who are being affected. And certainly, when you did have a plateauing of the virus in the Northeast, you did see jobs bounce back very quickly. However, since mid-June, we have seen the number of cases rise quite precipitously throughout the remainder of the country, with very huge chunks of GDP in effect. So if that's the case, then we should expect that some of the labor market measures are not going to be as strong going forward. And importantly, we've seen CapEx and trade really collapse. And unless you see CapEx pick up, and unless you see trade pick up, it's very difficult to see very strong gains in employment. And finally, I would say that when you look again at the types of people who've lost their jobs, it's been very heavy in services, as Chair Powell said, and some of these jobs may never be recovered.
Guys, we've got to leave it there. We could talk about the Fed for a long time, but it's a busy news day. Sarah, Paul, Dana, and Steve, thank you all for joining us.